I'm really pleased today to be able to invite Stefan Mao, who is Professor of Macro Sociology at the Humboldt University in Berlin. Stefan and I have known each other for about 30 years when he used to be young, energetic, young PhD student running around with his acetates, telling me about fantastic data he'd found. So I'm really thrilled to follow his career on from when he went to do his PhD in Florence and subsequently as professor in Bremen and now in Berlin. And he has enormous energetic input into a lot of quantitative comparative research. And I've also very much appreciated Stefan has a lot of different methodological approaches, as well as specializing in very sophisticated quantitative analysis. He's also been quite innovative in projects he's told me about, looking at comparing why persistent inequalities, for example, in elite recruitment in Germany, continues to neglect people from East Germany often. And he did some very imaginative research there that I very much appreciated. So when I saw his new book, I've been badgering him for a while to come and talk about it. So the details are on the website. I won't go into more detail. I want to hand over to you, Stefan, now to tell us about your new book. And then afterwards, we will enjoy some question and answers. So Stefan, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for inviting me and the introduction, Jackie. So I just open my screen and hope all works. Can you see it? Yes. Okay, I'm talking about a book that has been published in English, I think 1.5 years ago with Polity Press. It's called The Matrix Society on the Quantification of the Social. And the book is an attempt to come to terms, to make sense of the relationship between the digital transformation we experience and the impact on the structure of inequality. So what does that mean for social hierarchies, status, for the positioning within a specific social sphere? And we all know one giant project that is underway, not completed. There are some pilots already in place. That's an example of China building up a so-called social credit system. There's some scientific literature on that now, claiming that will be not as comprehensive as initially announced. Some people look into how it's run in Shanghai and some other places. But overall, we can see that there's an attempt to use quantitative data from all areas of life, be it education, be it mobility data, be it deviant behavior, to assign a score to people. And the score should more or less reflect the complete picture or the individual behavior in terms of being honest or behaving well or not. And of course, this is a very grim and maybe extreme example of the relationship between status work and digital data. I give you another example, which I have experienced myself 2 years ago in the US, and I looked it up today, whether the website is still online. It isn't, but it's still a very interesting example. And there was a website in place called mylife.com, and what you could do there is to type in a name and a zip code in the US, and then the system needed a few minutes to come up with an individual score. So we used it when recruiting a babysitter because so there was a direct link to that website to say you can only give your kids to people you trust. And how can you find trust? So you need information for that. And the website mylife.com basically offers a so-called reputation score for all adult Americans. And what they say on the website or said, reputation is more important than credit. Only My Life provides reputation scores, information based on information gathered from government, social, and other sources, plus personal reviews written by others. And what they do is they basically collect all individual information, names, age, place of birth, current addresses, telephone numbers, email addresses, and of course, all types of activities on social media, be it Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. but also all previous places of living, whether you're an owner of a house or not, all licenses, certain court files. So everything what can be collected, even information from the dark web are brought together. And in the end, you get an individualized score. Here is Michael Smith, 57 years old, and you even see whether he's in the green area or in the red area. And there were a lot of endorsements by users of the website. I don't know whether they are fake or real, but I found it quite interesting. So Luisa was very enthusiastic about it. And she wrote, "You'd be crazy to rent someone an apartment not looking at the reputation score first. It saved me tons of trouble." Ricardo said, "I declined a job offer after I did a reputation check on the guy who was going to be my supervisor." Finally, Larry, even better, "I felt a lot better about my daughter's new boyfriend after I ran a reputation score check." So this was used basically to place people in a hierarchy and to assign them a certain type of reputation status. The claim in my book is that these are not unique or isolated developments which we can observe here, but that we have a larger scale or even meta transformation towards more quantitative, data-driven forms of social rank ordering. Given all the data that are produced on a daily basis, so our purchasing habits, financial transactions, mobility profiles, friendship networks, health conditions, education, training, work, all that can be measured and captured in new digital data. And of course, you can remain an outsider to the digital life, but it's very difficult and very costly, and it's a form of self-exclusion today. And I think that this mega trend of quantification represents an independent system of hierarchization and classification. How does it look like? Yeah, there's a quantification code. That's one of the central claims of my book, and you can find that in the widespread use of ratings on different evaluation platforms, rankings, scores, or star system, where you give even numbers or grades to different types of activities, to services which are offered, or even to individuals. And there are two major drivers. One I already mentioned, that's the digitization. So basically the availability of different types of data, and they become a byproduct of everyday life. So once you have a mobile phone and you are moving around, you're producing data. And the second driver is, in my view, the process of economization. Some people claim it is also a kind of neoliberalization and the cult of transparency. So everything needs to be measured, everything needs to be quantified, and we can see that what is sometimes called audit society, or that you have different targets and benchmarks, that all has to be operationalized to some extent and put into data. It is interesting that this process, of course, does not mirror the real world outside, but creates a new world sui generis. It's, of course, related and coupled with the real world outside, but the quantitative representations recreate the social world. So they are not simply a mirror, but they have their own logics and their own kinds of specificities to reflect what the world out there really is. And I use more or less a Bourdieuian idea to claim that these kind of data are new symbols of distinctions. They attempt to objectify certain status information just as in the case of the babysitter. So you get a number between 1 and 5, and 5 is basically the most trustworthy person, and 1 is a person you would probably not hire. And in fact, of course, we often rely on data to capture and to tap very complex social phenomena. I think the British case is also somehow a role model or leading case, given all the different indicators that have been used, for example, in the area of health or education. So measurement is very much moving forward with the aim of strengthening efficiency and also performance. And of course, if you want to know about performance, you need to measure it. So what are the effects of this new cult of numbers? I would say there are basically 4 different impacts on our understanding of worth and quality. And the first is, of course, that the language of numbers changes our everyday conception of value, worth, and social status. The orders of worth are now basically tied to the language of numbers. Second, numbers by nature instigate comparisons. So they facilitate a kind of commensurability. So once you can express a certain social phenomena or characterize a person or an institution, an organization through numbers, then of course you are automatically in the world of comparison. So the numbers, they contextualize information, and they also allow to compare things which are without these data basically incomparable. Think about the system of science. So if you can measure the age index of a German sociologist, then you can easily compare him to a Chinese I don't know, astrophysicist, and these things become more and more easy. So you can have more or less comparisons, or better or worse comparisons. Thirdly, I claim that this kind of use of data is also leading to a universalization of competition. So comparisons also are closely linked to forms of competitions. And I think like prices on the market give a specific signal, also data signals something to people, exactly in the frame that I have mentioned before of better or worse or more or less. At the fourth stage, that is for me the most interesting one, is of course as soon as you have data, and these data imply a specific hierarchy, and you present most often these data in tables, in graph, in lists, or scores, and they transform qualitative differences into quantitative inequality. And there are very interesting consequences for the way social inequality is structured, but also legitimized. And I would now go on to mention a few examples from my book. I have many in there, so rating agencies, university rankings, mobility and health scores, impact measurement in science, platform economies, the rating of professions, but also self-quantification. So I mention now in the following only 2 of them, and the first is measurement of health. Of course, person's health is a very delicate and intimate issue, and it's very closely tied to the trust between a doctor and a patient. Now we have, of course, more and more health data which are available, which of course involve third parties, very often companies who basically develop specific tools or store the data, and you also share data more with insurance companies, with employers, and so on. What we also find is the widespread use of so-called new health scores. You have that at different health insurances which are using that, but also in the context of the health management of companies. And here's one example. It's called Dakadu. I think this is also a system that is used in the UK, where they measure specific lifestyle issues, but also well-being, but they also measure body data. These three things come together. And it's interesting, very often these are lifestyle products. Sometimes people apply it themselves, but quite often it's also used by health insurances in order to calculate a specific tariff or to encourage people to behave better. And here, just to make that example a little bit more specific, what you can find is, of course, a health score that gives you an exact value of your health status. So regardless of your real health, but what is measured is basically taken as what health basically is. And once you have that, then of course you can make comparisons with other people or with specific benchmarks which you should achieve or where you should not fall behind, but also with yourself. So over time you can make comparisons. So if you had a score of 800 before, then of course 671 is very low, and you are probably instigated to do a little bit more to adopt a better lifestyle, to do more sports, and so on. So you are automatically basically in that kind of competitive mode or rat race for a better or higher score, or not for falling behind. And it's very interesting because these are high, sometimes not so high quality data, but they are taken or as that, and that the involvement of others, so health companies, insurance companies, also makes that basically financially and economically relevant information. So it's not just a private issue, but it's also used, for example, for calculating your tariffs. And there's in the German system, we have different insurances which are using these or similar tools. And I found one very interesting interview with one of the managers of a big health insurance company in Germany, which has now established so-called bronze, silver, gold, and platinum and diamond customer status based on these kind of informations. And he says, so in the future, it will be the case that if someone mentions the diamond status at a party, people will see them as a cool guy. So that should be something you signal to other in order to enhance your social standing. The second example is the credit score. This is of course a very long-standing activity of financial institutions. So to calculate credit risk or the credit worthiness of customers, but it's now done in a different way. And I have here put examples of Movent. It's a New York-based company that offers a specific tool for calculating a credit score, but on a on an actual basis. So you don't have to ask a specific company, but you get it on a daily basis. And whenever you have a financial transaction, that kind of credit score changes. And they think that this is a contribution to the financial well-being of people because they have full control over this information, but also they would basically use this information to organize their financial behavior. And this credit score they are using is very interesting because it is using all available information of people's behavior, but it's going beyond. It also uses social network data to calculate people's credit score. So if you have if you are on Facebook and you have people with a low socioeconomic status in your circle of friends, then your credit score lowers. So you should, of course, look for those who have a very high status. So you are in a better financial position due to that fact. And of course, we also see that these kind of data are not only used in the context of financial activities, but they are basically there are certain spillovers into other areas. For example, employers do credit checks. So in the US, there are surveys that show that 60% of all employers carry out credit checks before taking on new staff in order to gain an overall impression of each applicant and his or her trustworthiness. We find that people use these kind of information, that credit score, on the dating market to send specific status signals. So new websites in the US allow users to publish their own score so that others can be fully informed about their financial biography, the financial potency, and their credit status. And we also have maybe one last example, that these kind of credit scores, for example, the Sesame credit score has been used for visa application purposes. There's a new 2 years old, I think, stipulation between Canada and China, that Chinese citizens can basically use that credit score when they apply for a visum to Canada. So it's a completely unrelated matter. So it's international cross-border travel and has nothing to do with the request for a credit or certain conditions of a credit, but that kind of information travels then to other areas. And I think we can find many different arenas where specific types of digital status information are not limited anymore to that the specific arena they were initially related to, but that they basically move across borders. So what kind of inequality regime can we expect or interpret on the basis of that kind of view? So of course, with Bourdieu, we can say that status data are a type of symbolic capital, and that's even more so if they are publicly available or if third parties can use them. And what the specific trade of symbolic capital, that you can make economic or material gains on the basis of reputation. So that, of course, makes people strive for even better data. Symbolic capital in form of these kind of status data can be converted into material advantages, or also into social capital like useful contacts. And after all, just to quote Bourdieu, the display of symbolic capital ensures that capital attracts capital. So that kind of metrics offer specific opportunities to gain advantages because it enables certain comparisons. So going back to the babysitter I mentioned at the beginning, so if you are listed as a babysitter and people run a reputation score check, then of course a person with a 3 will probably not get the job, but a person with a 4.8 or 4.5 has much better market opportunities. If that is the case, then of course the traditional category of a good reputation now becomes increasingly tied to specific forms of data which are available, and people then have to make certain efforts to become data rich or reputation rich on that basis. The question here is a little bit to what could that lead? Of course, there could be a lot of white noise, so people do not react to that kind of status signals. But in many other areas where it becomes really relevant for life chances, they probably will react. And Marion Foucault has written interesting stuff on that, claiming that this may stipulate certain types of investive behavior and instigate entrepreneurial orientation, leading maybe to a situation where people turn into capitalists of the self, and that these kind of data will become as important for individual behavior as economic indicators are for enterprises or for national economy. Foucault and Greer and Haley speak of Überkapital. So that's a data-based form of capital, compiling, accumulating, assembling, interlinking data from various sources, basically leads to an amount of information and enables very extensive datafication of the social. So that could be a capitalization of the life world. Some people say, of course, quantification has also a very good side because it may rationalize status assignment processes because it ties the evaluation of people closer to their real performance. For example, think about car insurance. So if you have a telematic tariff, so you really measure individual driving behavior, then you are not clustered into rough categories or not according to the zip code where you live, but the actual performance counts. And to some extent, it might be true that some parts can be more rational, but at the same time, we know about the discriminatory biases of these systems. So they measure only what they measure, so not the full reality. They are highly selective. They often relate to specific standard cases. We have problematic feedback loops. So very often these systems do not adjust to the empirical world outside, but rather they format or reformat the empirical world according to the model's assumptions. We have systematic forms of exclusion. Virginia Eubanks has an interesting book on automating inequality, where she claims that we have, at least at the lower end of the social strata, new digital poor houses, so people which have very bad data or scores in one particular area, and then there are spillovers to others. So they have a lack of financial means. They do not get access to the housing market. They do not get jobs. And these people basically form the lower classes of a digital society. We have very strong winner-takes-all effects. So success breeds success. In sociology, we have the theory of cumulative advantage, to say so that there are minor differences at the beginning, but that they grow over time. As for example, with a Matthew effect in with scientific citations, and we have problems of super scores. So these are like the Chinese credit score scores, which basically take data from all areas of life and affect all areas of life at the same time. And if you have digital scarves and or problems in your digital biography, that is basically affecting then all different aspects where these data are used. Final point from my side, I also would say that digitization means also a difference revolution, because the more detailed and the more comprehensive we can measure individuals or individual behavior, the more likely it is that differences become socially relevant. So more and more fine-grained distinctions are being made. So instead of being collectivized or forced into large statistical collectives, everyone can now expect to be treated as an individual. So it's very similar to a zooming in into a group photo, so that individuals stand out with ever greater clarity. So digitization also means that we can increase the degree of precision. So that also has some consequences for political economy, but also for group conflicts. There is maybe a process of hyper individualization underway, which is infinitely and maybe endlessly, and combines observations of difference. So my claim would be quantification of the social also means divisibility of the social. So people are not classified into collective group categories anymore. And therefore, we are not moving into a digital class society, as some people have claimed, but rather the other way around. So it goes into the other direction. So we can observe a shift of the inequality regime away from class conflict, so the classic class conflict, if you like, towards competition between individuals. So, or alternatively, universities, hospitals, professions, or even states, which are quantified and classified too, which I think of rating agency, depending, of course, on the unit of classification we are focusing on. So what's the difference between a conflict of classes and a competition of individuals? Conflicts of classes, they basically imply an antagonism or a struggle between parties, whereas competition consists of even with others in relation to specific performance goals. So you become a competitor, you try to surpass or to excel others rather than to fight for power or for a reallocation of means. So this conflict of over power, participation, and redistribution is maybe given way to a game of escalation. So where outdoing, overtaking, optimizing replaces the old types of conflict. And it's also very likely, to use Marx terms, that class for itself is very unlikely to form, because we only, so in this kind of investive and status work game, we only conceive ourselves as individuals rather than as members of specific classes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I think that's a fantastically provocative contribution. I really enjoyed the book. While we're waiting, people would like to raise questions in the chat, then we can go to those people and they can ask them themselves, or I'll ask them for them. So please fire ahead with that. I really liked the book because I thought you had brought together quite a number of disparate empirical cases that are very interesting, of which my life, for example, I didn't know about. And I thought you brought them together in a way to develop a more kind of macro level type of theory. But I've got a number of questions I'd like to ask, first of all. First of all, could we assume, in some senses, there's an assumption in the work that there is a potential on the negative side, a universal surveillance panopticon, that's something similar possibly to the Chinese government you cite at the beginning, and then in the talk you give the case of the American one. But this is an assumption that all these different systems actually can speak to each other. And what we know from doing organizational research, even within some really brilliant British and other universities, the HR and payroll system don't even talk to each other properly. So could a criticism be that maybe it's assuming that somebody out there is running the Death Star, and actually that's not the truth. There's lots of different parallel systems all running anarchically in place, collecting and putting together lots of different types of data. But often these don't really work as well as we might think they would. So can I put that as a first question? Do they really work that well?
No, I think in practice, not yet. But the decisive point for me would be, are they taken as working well. So I think the fictitious part of the whole thing is very important. So whether something works or the data are blurry or problematic or misspecify people does not really matter if users of these systems assume that they present proper data. I give you another example of a book I recently published on the transformation of borders, so where smart borders become more important. Most of our visa systems, so if people apply for a visa, are now based on scoring systems. So whether they are good or not, we don't really know, but they have a very strong effect on whether people receive a visa or are rejected. And that's a decisive thing. So they can build on a fictitious basis. They can be utterly wrong, but still they will produce an effect. The other part of your question is, of course, that very often these systems, the interoperability of these systems is relatively low, and I would agree that we do not have a comprehensive unified system of status production. So these are all bits and pieces. But it can change over time. So I cannot look into the future, but what has developed so far, also when I wrote the book 4 years ago, it was even published before Cambridge Analytics. And I think a lot of information then came out where we can really see that the data collection on individual behavior has made a lot of progress over the last 5 or so years. And if I project it in the future, I would say, it's if it keeps that level and the speed, then the systems might become more comprehensive and more unified in the near future.
Cool. I've got 3 people already with their hands up or questions. So would it be okay to take all 3 to allow more people to speak? So when you speak, when I invite Andreas first, Cornelius from King's, would you like to briefly introduce yourself and your question? And then I have Stefan Kesting from Leeds and Simon Deakin from Cambridge. So over to you, Andreas, first of all.
Well, hello, everyone. Stefan, thank you very much for this wonderful presentation. I'm Andreas Cornelius. I'm from King's College London, and I'm also associated with Digit because of the Digit project that is funded. So I just want to start by saying that I'm really happy to see classic sociological concepts like status coming into the debate, like going back to Max Weber and so on, which are very relevant for this quantification that we see in society. I mean, my question is, and it's sort of trying to tease out your view about this. Do you think that this is something completely new, this quantification, this obsession with rankings, with reputation, with measurement, or it just has taken a different form because of all the data that is available, or it has intensified? I mean, I can recall university rankings at least since 1993, from the times and so on, when there were not so many data available. Similarly, like, I mean, there was not Twitter, but celebrities or sort of singers or others like could signal their status on the basis of other indicators. So maybe is this something new completely, or is this just an intensification of a pre-existing trend?
Okay, before I let you answer that, Stefan, would Stefan Kesting from Leeds like to ask your question in person, the one you have in the chat? I'd like to hand over so people get their voices heard. It's not.
Thanks. Yes, I can do that. Thank you, Stefan. Very.
Briefly as well.
Yeah, I'm Stefan Kessing. I'm a lecturer at the Business School, economist, but I'm also a member of the Society for Advancement of Socioeconomics. I'm very much in that, in your team, Stefan, and I really like the Surkamp corner of books that I see in the background behind you. So now I've just and from that sassy kind of background, Etzioni and all that comes my question. So that, because at the end, and that was probably just a very rough picture that you gave, that so you had class conflict, very collective macro kind of category on the one side, and then you had this really individualist notion of the competition. And I was like, is there a meso level where you get to co-opetition, or where, and it's sort of related to this other question that's in the chat about don't communities still play quite a role, and that people are still socially embedded and have social relations, and that so there is a bit of a more complex context for that competition picture that you draw. And then also to Andreas, if I may just add one more sentence, Ben Fine, one of the when he defines neoliberalism, one of the definitions is this measurement, that quantification as a typical feature.
Okay, and the last, sorry, they're rather chunky questions. Do you want to reply to them, or shall I let Simon come in? What would you like, Stefan?
Shall I?
Yeah, go on, have a quick go, but try and make it short so I can get lots of people.
Okay, yeah, with regard to Andreas' question, so I'm a little bit undecided on that issue. And of course, I also in the book I mentioned the long tradition of university rankings, but also of credit scoring. So it's not a social technique that is completely new, but I think it has gained a new quality due to this kind of intermingling of neoliberalization, if you like, and digitalization. And so that coming together produces data all the time. And even if you don't produce data purposefully, you still have them because they are a side product of our everyday behavior. And I think this is quite a new level, and also the volume of data and the availability of data storage. That's quite unique. That would be but it's a little bit undecided. For Stefan, yeah, I agree totally, and so I have a very maybe too rough picture also in my book, but I think. My interest was to show the common traits of these different developments. So, because if you look at there are different studies on each single area. I mean, there are books on university rankings, very interesting books, but I wanted to spell that out as a very general feature of societal development. Notwithstanding the different nuances and also the meso-level context, which is quite important, I think. Maybe this is a task of more empirical studies, which I haven't undertaken in that book.
Okay, should we move on? Is that enough? Do you want to move on to Simon Deakin?
Thank you very much, Stefan. Hi.
For those who don't know you.
Simon Deakin from the Digit project at Cambridge University. I'm going to suggest that, in fact, is the opposite of what you have suggested, that the individual is less important and class becomes more important with this form of digitization. And that's because of the way that machine learning models in particular tend to produce results which are not just reproducing biases which exist in society, but actually freeze them in and scale them up. And you can see that with the way in which US probation and sentencing software discriminates against African-American people, the way in which data from cameras that are held by police officers with body cameras are directing the police to deal with crime in apparently high crime areas, but in fact they're areas where more African-American people live. This is because the techniques used are not just finding out stuff about each of us as an individual, but they're extrapolating from what is known and collected through data to what's known about other people. So the most important thing about me when it comes to my credit rating may well be that I'm a white male or not. So I'd like to gently suggest the truth is the opposite of what you've argued.
you want to reply to that one directly? Because that's quite a big question.
Yes, it's a very interesting question. I'm also struggling a little bit with that because if we have all the data on you as an individual, then of course that you're a white male may not play such a big role because you so the collectivity can be dissolved. That would be my my claim. And what we have now is basically a situation in between where we still have forms of statistical discrimination where you derive information from larger data sets and then use them for certain classificatory processes and also addressing individuals, but still as examples or representatives of a specific group. If you have complete data on an individual, you don't need to do that anymore. And that would be basically the difference. I still believe that there can be some features of class society, but not in the way of collectivization, but in the different affectedness by these forms of status measurement. For example, so very rich people do not have to look for a health insurance with the best tariff. So they can simply afford to be unobserved. So top people from Silicon Valley, they have wooden toys for their kids. They don't use mobile phones and so on. And you have a situation, I think, I can't recall, there's this British series where they also rank people permanently. You all know that. I can't recall the title, where there's a lorry driver, a female lorry driver, and she's at the lower end of the social set. So her data, her metrics are so bad that she does not care anymore. So it could be that the middle class is most affected by that kind of quantification because they are very much into that kind of investive status work. Whereas the lower classes, they have little to gain, but also little to lose. And the upper classes, they can afford to basically to stay outside of these systems.
Can I bring in, before I go on to the next two questions from Hayley and Nigel, kind of to contribute to this discussion between yourself and Simon that's just come up. Do you think we should distinguish between where data is generated voluntarily or people have a degree of agency in affecting their status work or their maintenance of their reputation, and data that's collected involuntarily or in oblivion that they're actually collecting this data? So facial recognition systems or different forms of the way CCTV works, or some of the data that's collected around prison records, etc., or social security records. People don't always have any agency necessarily how that data is collected. So this could be a segue between the two arguments. So on one hand, what Simon's really looking at is data that's involuntarily collected that categorizes you as a particular type of poorly educated, potentially violent, criminal, etc. activity because you belong to a particular postcode of which you have maybe no choice about where you actually live, compared to data where you can affect your status work. So briefly, for example, some of the work one of my colleagues, Io, has been doing on people working on digital platforms selling secondhand clothes, whether they use Depop or Vinted or Instagram. It's really about your status maintenance of your profile. And people are very, very actively engaged in that. And you cite, some people in the book, how people are affected by getting the likes. So would that be a way of kind of segueing between the differences the two of you are pointing out or not? Or is that just too complicated?
No, I think this is a fundamental difference, whether it's voluntary, but sometimes voluntary just appears to be voluntary, but in fact, there's also a normative expectation to do that, or you can also run into disadvantages by not doing that. So if all people basically give away their data freely, then of course for the remaining people, it can become more costly to stay away from that. But the use of data can also be very emancipatory. So for example, to make certain performances, some achievements visible which were invisible before. So we know that from sports. So when Black people entered sports competition, and of course, so to compare yourself and to have a fair chance to make your own performance visible is also something good. So I would not only see the negative side; it has also good sides. And I think that whether it's voluntary or involuntary is quite decisive. But very often you cannot see the difference anymore. I give you again another example from the mobility issue I'm working on now. There's a US firm called Clear, and so they provide technology for securing mobility, so collecting information on individuals when they check in at an airport or cross a border. And you can go into a speedy line. So you can basically have your own line by entering a plane. And so giving away your data, for example, on financial transactions, on mobility history is voluntarily, of course, but you get something in return. But all the others, they have to line up at the airport. And you also give your biometric information, like iris scan and face measurement in order to get that kind of benefit. And I think these kind of mix of voluntary, involuntary is the most common form to get hold of people's data, but also to give something in return, of course.
Cool. We've only got a few minutes left, so could I hand over to Hayley and Hayley Cordingley and Nigel Tart? Would you like to ask your questions briefly?
Hi there. So I'm in professional services over at University of Sussex. So mine was just, I'm a research metrics analyst. So you guys are all a lot more embedded in all of this than I am. I'm just in a small portion, but it's just really interesting listening and the reflection about the perception of something that's being measured and ranked or compared. What you are touching on, that if you're measuring and making the comparison, it must be robust. But then this thing about actually just how flaky things behind it sometimes are, like you were saying, and the way that you can, if your Facebook stuff says something about you. So obviously the realm that I'm in, it's trying to actually get things more robust, and we do a lot of work around the responsible use of metrics. So it's just really interesting hearing how in society in general, this adoption of metrics without really thinking about it and without any responsible use around it is it's just really interesting. That's all I really wanted to add into the mix.
Okay, cool. Does anybody else have any further questions to that? Nigel seems to say, no, webcam, Nigel, do you want to actually ask the question on over voice? Yes, no, shall I read it out for him before my computer says it's going to get tired? Right, Nigel said, do you think reputation we built or suffered from attending events like this? Ha ha ha, but we increased, obviously. How do you think critical discussion could become stifled? I don't really understand exactly what that means, but critical discussion of the use of these indicators. I want to add, I'm not quite sure I understand Nigel. So Nigel,
I think Nigel may have left, but I think that he popped that up when he was talking about your Facebook profile and the people that you surrounded with. So he's being a flippant thing, but then if you are being tracked, and the people that you're interacting with are also being tracked, is that actually going to stifle discussion? You'll stop interacting with people that you don't want to be associated with.
Do you have anything you want to add on that, Stefan?
Yes, maybe to Hayley's issue, I think this is exactly my point. So of course, I'm not so condemning data and say so it's all very bad. I'm not a cultural critic. But to have a meaningful and also justified understanding of data, what can you do with them? What's the quality of the data? Where do they make sense and where not? And this is for me basically the main approach. I'm a quantitative researcher myself, so I know how difficult it is to have a good measure of something. because most measures, they confuse the measurement with a concept. There are very famous examples. And then they have, of course, very adverse incentives. So where people basically behave according to the measurement, but not according to the concepts you are interested in. And in many areas, so teaching, health, social services, we have a very strong confusion where people think so living according to the measures gives you a good performance. But in fact, it's the other way around, because you have no good measures. You simply measure what you can easily measure, and in the areas, for example, of care. In my book, I also use an example of the Vietnam War, where dead bodies are counted. So combatants. So what's a combatants in a civil war? It's very difficult to say. So you give soldiers a very wrong incentive to kill more people than actually should be killed, and even kill civilians, and to count them as combatants. And these kind of problems you can find basically everywhere where you use data. Maybe Jackie, I can mention a very last one that comes from the British health system, from the NHS. So I think, I don't know whether it still exists. So there was an indicator that was called emergency calls solved at telephone. So what kind of indicator is it? So if you tell someone, please, so it's not so urgent and so on, solve the problem by yourself, then you have a very good indicator for the hospital, but you don't know what happened to the person afterwards, after she or he hang up. Was a more serious problem? Did that person die? So that's more decisive. And so for me, it's a very bad indicator, because you don't really know what it means, and you need the context to make a proper judgment of the quality of the data.
Well, I think that's a very good place to sum it up, of what is it we're actually measuring, and how does it tell you? I don't know if we're having a short poll. Oh, well, there we are, to evaluate how you enjoyed this session. So we're able to compare all our digit debates. And so if you'd like to fill that in as we wind up, can I just say thank you, Stefan? I think you've really helped contribute to many of the debates here at Digit, and, triggering both theoretical issues about how we conceptualize these changes, and empirically how we measure them and what they all mean. So I really like to thank you very much for that. I think it's a very good book and worth reading. Also, I had a little shout out there, excuse me, to the SARSE Salon debates that are coming up. And these are online events for members of SARSE, or if you want to become a member of SARSE, please join us. And one thing I think you might find interesting in particular is the work of Ali Hochschild, looking at the rise of the radical right in America. So on one hand, some of these people feel very dislocated and estranged from mainstream issues that are going on in America, but at the same time, often using digital media to manage it. And there's also a very nice contribution from Hong Kong colleagues looking at how digital media enables these connections and voices. But at the same time, the control by the Chinese government helps also to shut them down. So maybe you'll be able to join us for some of those, and for the continuing digital debates this term. So thank you very much, everybody, for a very great session. Thanks, Stefan.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.